person. My name is Dominic, and I'm one of the pastors here. And if you're here for the first time, being in church might be weird, new, overwhelming, all that fun stuff. And so we're just happy that you're here. If you're watching on Facebook Live, what's up? Come see us in person. We always encourage people to come and see us in person. But this morning, for some of you, maybe you don't know this, this is actually a special Sunday, and it's called Palm Sunday. How many of you knew that? Palm Sunday? How many? If you didn't know, it's okay. We love you anyway. But there's a lot of people that at this time of year, I often feel the weight for people who kind of almost get bombarded with stuff about Christianity and the Bible. And I know a lot of people, maybe just like you do, that they don't believe in God, or they're not into Christianity, and they're kind of always overwhelmed. And so this week somebody sent me a note, and they said, Dom, did you know there's this movie about the Bible that just came out? And I'm like, oh yeah, I think I heard about it, and it's called Mary Magdalene. How many of you heard this? If you haven't, you don't have internet. But anyway, it's everywhere, and it's this, the trailer came out, and the person sent me the email, said, did you know that Jesus kind of was really having kind of this romantic relationship with Mary Magdalene? I'm like, oh, really? I never heard this. They're like, oh, that's in the movie. I'm like, oh, okay, the movie's wrong, but you should watch it. It might be interesting. And so it's interesting because we live in a time where so many people are interested in Bible stories, Bible people, characters. And I'm not shocked when I meet people who are not Christians who are confused. I'm just shocked when I meet people who call themselves Christians who are confused. That's always more shocking to me. Because I'll be like, hey, you know it's Palm Sunday? They're like, what's that? I'm like, hey, okay, it's in the Bible. It's important. The idea of the word Palm Sunday is not in the Bible, but the story from where we get the meaning of this week, we call Holy Week, is in the Bible. And so I just want to encourage some of you, maybe if you're here for the first time, you're still learning about God, this is a good week to be here. Because we're really going to take some steps and slow down and help you understand parts of the Christian story that are essential to understanding why people call themselves Christians. Why they would still follow this guy who lived a long time ago and was a teacher and maybe more than that and all that stuff. And so we want to encourage you especially to be really sensitive. If you know someone, you love someone, you're in a relationship, working friend, that maybe they just have these questions and you're like, you know what? Would you be open to coming and learning some of this with us at our church and exploring some of this together? And so this morning, actually, I want to end a series and kind of move us into Holy Week by talking about two parts of the Bible. Make it really, really simple. I want to tell you a story about a person in the Bible who lives in the Old Testament. His name is Moses. Some of you know him, or have heard of him. You don't know him personally, because that would be weird. But you know of him. And then I want to tell you about the time when Jesus comes to Jerusalem and we get the idea of Palm Sunday from. And I want to hold these two characters together, and so hopefully get a bigger picture of what this week is about. Now, for some of you who've been here, you know that for the past 4 weeks, we've been in a series on the desert. We've called it it's a miracle, and how God steps into our world in moments where we feel like we're in the desert, and he does something that we never expected. He actually has a miracle for us that's waiting there. Now, I got to be honest, okay? When we started this series, and myself, and usually Bethany and I, Bethany's on our team, and she helps with some of the graphics, I was really nervous about the slide, because I'm like, the desert for a lot of people doesn't really mean much. I'm like, you see sand and you think it's hot, but you don't care because we get freezing rain here and the power goes out forever. So I was kind of torn, but as the series went on, I was so encouraged about many of you just talking to me and saying, Dom, this series has really felt timely for us. We felt that we've been in a little bit of a desert in our marriage, a little bit of a desert as parents. It's felt like a desert of the unknown about things that are going on in our lives, and this series is helping us. And so that's why we do this. That's why we shape a teaching series around some of these themes to help you. And if you haven't been here, I just want to remind you of where we've been in the series. One of the things that we've tried to do consistently in the series is to remind you of a few different things, a few different miracles that God has for you in the desert. And the desert is those moments where we feel alone, where the only image that maybe comes to mind is that things are dry. You used to be alive, you used to be excited, you used to care, you used to have a sense of purpose, and then that slowly has gone away. You know why that happens? Because life happens. Because we get tired. It's like meeting a couple on their honeymoon and then seeing them a year later. You're like, hey, what happened? Life kind of happens, things happen. It's not necessarily even bad things. It's just things over time. And so the desert for you looks differently than maybe it does for me. But in this series, what we've tried to do is that when you're in the desert, when you have those moments where you're feeling that, God comes to us with a miracle that says, I care for you. Maybe for some of you, that's the miracle you needed to have. That God says, I know you feel like alone, I know you feel overwhelmed, I know you feel like scared of what's going on, but I really, really care. And I'm here with you, that you're going to be fine. For some of you, maybe the desert, the miracle that God had for you is that God is going to correct things in the desert. God not only cares for us in the desert, God also corrects things in the desert. He corrects the wrong perspectives people have of him, the strange ideas people have about God. We all have kind of ideas. They're like, oh, that's not really who God is like. I know a lot of people that still think that God is somewhere in the sky, this mean God waiting to kill people when they're bad, and they made a mistake, and they're like, no, you're going to get it, you know. And then they connect it to this idea of karma, like I did a bad thing, I think a bad thing's going to happen to me, or I did a good thing, I hope good things happen. You might have heard some of that stuff. That's really not the Christian understanding of God at all. You know, so if you've been here, maybe the miracle that God has been giving to you, that, hey, let me correct some of these. Let me just kind of reshape this for you in a new way. So he cares for us, and he corrects. But here's another thing that God does in the desert. This is the one we least want God to do in the desert, is he convicts us of things that have to change. He kind of starts to say, you know this habit here? If you keep doing this, you're going to be in the desert a long time. The desert's going to feel a lot more painful than it has to. And you know there's this great story in the Bible where that actually happens. His people, they're called the people of Israel, they're in the desert and they're leaving this time of being slaves in a place called Egypt. And now they should kind of move through the desert and experience this blessing from God. And instead of doing that in a very simple way, it'll take years and years for them to learn new things in the desert. That's painful. If you're in that kind of situation, you know the pain of that. Where God has been trying to remind you that there's some habits that have kind of gripped your heart, and if you don't surrender those to God and ask for forgiveness, they will destroy you. They will destroy your family. They will destroy everything around you. That's what the desert's for. Now, I want to tell you one last thing that the desert is about, and I want to finish with this idea. And this is something in the desert that most Christians that I've experienced my whole life will miss. Most people miss this great miracle that's waiting for them in the desert. Okay? I've been a pastor quite a while now, and I meet people all the time, and every time I get to this point in my chat with them, I'm like, wow, they missed this miracle. So my prayers this morning is that as we learn, God would awaken in you a sense of saying, God, I don't want to miss this miracle that you might have for me. Because not only does God care for us in the desert, not only does God have a sense of, correcting and convicting in the desert, but in the desert, God gives us clarity about our call for this life in the desert. How many of you believe that God still calls people to be involved in his work in the world? Don't put your hand up, because some of you are like, no, I don't think so, so no shame. But I know a lot of people who don't believe that. I grew up learning about this in a very, very weird way. When I was kind of learning about church, I was an altar boy for a little while. My parents went to a Pentecostal church with the, fire, flags, all that fun stuff. And I was like, where do I fit? I don't know what's going on. And so the way I learned about calling is that God calls some people to be pastors. And I was like, okay, great. So if I'm not going to be a pastor, what happens next? Nothing. And so you have these called people, they're super spiritual people that they pray and they teach and they do all this stuff. And then there's the people that are just they help the pastor. We hope they help the pastor. Some do, some. Okay. You know what I'm saying. So that's a whole nother sermon series. I can't get into that now. But there's a sense that there's this gap where we lose a sense that God actually has this unique call that he has for you based on the gifts and the skills and the passion that you have that he wants to use in this world. Now, some of you might be called to be a pastor. I know people that I love, and they're missionaries. They're like, God is sending us to Zimbabwe. I'm like, wow, it's amazing. When I told people that God was calling me to come to Quebec with Bev and maybe start this new church, people are like, that, wow. I said, you think God could ever do that for you? They're like, no, I'm not into that. Not into that. You know why? Because we connect our calling to our career. We think my career will be my calling. And then when we do this happens. We go on and we do everything we want to do with our lives, and we pray for God to bless it. And then when God doesn't bless it, we get mad. We're like, how come my business is not going better? How come I didn't get a raise? How come this? How come that? How come that? Now, don't get me wrong. Careers are important, but in the career, whatever you've called to do, God also has something special that's a calling. So let me give you a way of understanding what calling is. Okay? There's a lot of definitions, but I'll give you one that's easy. A calling from God is connected to you saying yes to Jesus. So this is the universal calling that everybody has. Okay? God calls us to follow Jesus. Okay? And in the Bible, there's this beautiful verse. I read it often. I come back to it. It's in Ephesians. You'll see behind me. It says this. Just go. As a prisoner for the Lord, Paul's writing to Christians. He says, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. That now, because you understand that God loves you, live a life that's connected to the fact that he's called you to be his child. Live that way. So the decisions you make, the way you interact with others, the way you spend your money, the way you listen, the way you love others should flow out of the fact that God called you and said to you, I love you. Everything changes. Everything. So Paul is saying, while he's in prison, by the way, think about writing this while you're in prison. You're like, hey, my life. No, he doesn't say that. He says, hey, I want to urge you and remember that you're called to live a life that's rooted in the call that God invited you into this family. Okay, and to make it easy, that's just kind of the general calling that God calls people, calls us. And then there's this unique, specific calling that God has for us. And the desert is the place where God refines that. He shows us that. He kind of gives us a sense that we have gifts that other people don't have, and that calling emerges. So let me give you a definition for the calling of God in our lives. The calling of God in your life and in my life is always connected to a burden that God gives you for His greater kingdom. Okay? That's really important. It's a burden that you start to have that God gives you for something bigger than yourself that points people to Jesus. Now, if you don't develop that, your calling is always about how God blesses you so that you could be better in life. That happens. Because that's a natural way that we connect calling. But in the Bible, calling is when God says, hey, I'm going to bless you. It's wonderful. You have a job. Be a good parent. Be all these things, all that stuff. But in the midst of that, the anchoring core of that should be this burden that I've called you to do something that others can't do. I've called you to give of yourself, to serve in such a way, to love in such a way, in a way that others won't be able to because you're gifted in that way. And one day, when you die, Jesus will ask you, what did you do with the call I put on your life? What will you do? What did you do with that? And I know a lot of people are going to be like, I don't know. I wasn't a pastor. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do announcements as good as Leah did. But I don't know. I didn't. I focused on my career. I did other things, and I was hoping that would count. And God's like, not really. So this morning, I want you to see something so important. That part of the desert times in our lives and part of those moments when we feel like we're not sure is when God's maybe reminding us that in the midst of all the other things that we do, He actually has called us to something much deeper. You know, I've met people in life over the years where they have a really clear sense that God's called them to something and to serve and to have a burden, whether they're helping a person or serving in a hospital or whatever. Bigger than that. And you know those people, when they lose their job, they're never disoriented. There's a sense that their identity is not in their job. Their identity is in a call, and they do a job. And they have things that they do, and they have places that they serve, and they have these other things. But when our calling and when God's purposes for our lives are not worked out in our hearts, we start to find our identity in all these things where people recognize us for those things. And God in the desert starts to refine stuff in us, where He reminds us that He's calling us to something much bigger than just the job you might have now, or the things that you thought were important. Because the calling for all of us is connected to a burden that God is wanting to put on your heart. Now, there's a person in the Bible that I want to talk to you about who doesn't believe this anymore. His name is Moses. Moses is this profound, mysterious, difficult to understand leader in the Bible who goes through this crisis because he makes a mistake and his whole life is in shambles after that mistake. So I don't have time to kind of develop the whole story, but I want to just focus on one moment for Moses, which is this famous part of his life in Exodus chapter 3. So you can read the whole story. Some of you maybe know it already. It's such a beautiful moment because Moses is about, most scholars believe he's about he's been 40 years old when God calls him. He's going to be 80 years old when he goes to see Pharaoh. So he's kind of caught in this limbo for about 40 years. Okay, and he's running away. And if you don't remember anything else I say about Moses, remember this. It's easy to remember. He's a murderer. Okay? That means he spent most of his life kind of running away and figuring stuff out and finding a place to hide and getting his life back on track. And when we meet him in Exodus chapter 3, he's kind of done that. He's like, fine, I hope nobody checks my profile on Google. That'd be crazy. Nobody Googles me. Okay, it's going to be weird. Wanted, Moses, murderer, find him, kill him. He's safe, pre-internet. So Moses has this moment where his whole life is now shaped around like the past is the past. It's dealt with. I don't have to do anything anymore. And something happens. God is preparing to show Moses a miracle in the desert. God has a miracle for Moses that he doesn't expect. Many of us know the story of Moses. And if you know a bit of the story of Moses, you think of the 10 plague miracles. Mateo did a great job last week of talking about that. Okay, you can listen to it online. But many of us, we love, when we think of miracles, we think of something flashy, like a big showy thing. But in the desert, God does miracles that you can't sell that way. You can't pitch them that way. They are much deeper. And so Moses is going to learn this very important lesson that we all have to learn. Ready for it? If you're taking notes, whatever. You're into tweeting, do whatever you want with it. But this is it. That God first has to do a miracle in us before he does a miracle through us. Okay? God first has to do a miracle in us before he uses us and can trust us to have the authority of miracle to do miracles in another context. Moses is stuck in this moment and he has no idea that God's going to use him to do some of the most mind-blowing things anybody had seen at the time. But before that happens, Moses is going to have to deal with this encounter that God finds him as he's watching sheep in the wilderness, in this desert place. He's in a place called Midian. And Moses finds himself in this place, and what I want you to understand is that Moses is kind of moved on, and God's going to do something that all of us hate when God does. God's going to take Moses back to the place where he first experienced his pain. Can you imagine that Moses for 40 years has been running away from the place, which is Egypt, where he killed someone, and God says, hey Moses, it's going to be great. I have a plan for us. You're going to do this. You're going to go back to Egypt. Ready? No, that's not happening, God. That's not a good idea. I've just spent my whole life putting that in the past. I spent my whole life pretending that didn't happen. I spent my whole life thinking that I'm beyond that. God's like, you're not beyond that. We got to heal that properly. This is the great gift of the desert. The desert is that place where God comes to and says, this thing that you think you've let me heal, this thing that you think you've let go of, maybe I still have to deal with. Maybe we still have to work out a bit more. God has a miracle for you in the desert. And it begins by him reminding you that your past can only be healed when he steps in and says that your past doesn't define who you are now. I mean, people say this all the time. I hear preachers, a t-shirt, I see Facebook, your identity is not your past and the future. I get tired of it sometimes, okay? But nobody tells you the painfulness of that. The painful work it takes to get honest about a broken marriage. Nobody tells you about the pain that it takes to say, like, I lost my job because of this and that. Nobody talks about that. We actually have a culture that says, how about we just run away as fast as possible from that? Move on, just say unfriend, ghost somebody, if you know what ghosting is. You're like, pretend they don't exist, whatever. Let's do that. God's like, no, let's not do that. Let's wait in the desert and watch how I heal this. Let's do that. This is the hard work. But if we do this, a miracle is waiting for us. And Moses is going to have to feel that. Moses is going to have to feel the weight of that. And just like me or you, if you're in this moment in the desert, he has this burning bush. If you don't know the story, there's this bush that he's around. He's probably seen a lot. And it seems like it's on fire, but it's not burning out. And he's confused. I would be confused that he gets closer. And you'll see the screen behind me. This is what happens in the story. This is what the burning bush says to him. And then the bush said this. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So now, just a few verses over, go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Wow. It's like, can you imagine this moment of like, God's like, I am aware of the woundedness and the pain that my people are feeling. And in this moment, Moses, you're the one I'm calling. I want you to understand that I have a special call for you. I'm not Moses, you're not Moses. Trust me. Moses had a special call. And in this moment, Moses' call is going to be to have to go back to the place where this all began. See, all of us want God to find us when we're in the desert. But very few of us want to get honest that sometimes God uses us to go help other people who are in the desert. We don't want that. We just want God to help us. I want God to care for me. I want God to help me. But in the desert, when we experience God's power, we then are awoken. This burden is awoken in us to say, hey, you know those other people in the desert? Did you care about them? Moses is honest. He's like, listen, I'm not really good at this. I'm not the guy for this. And if you read the story, it's this beautiful moment of grace where God's like, Moses has all the best excuses. Like he has all the best things. It's like, I think about when I ask my kids to do something. It's like, hey, could you go clean your room? Dad, my leg. Okay. So your leg, how bad does it hurt? Like 1 to 10. Well, I'm not sure. It hurt more like an hour ago. Then another son of mine. I'm like, oh, could you go help your mom with that? Oh, my arm, Dad, my arm. You think I'm joking, but they really do this. I'm like, does your arm hurt like enough to not play Zelda on the Xbox, on the Wii for like a week? Oh, no, it's feeling better. It's feeling better. I feel like it's all better. All right. We all have these excuses. They're just natural to us. Because all of us want God to care for us in the desert, but nobody wants God to call them in the desert. God's like, the desert, you get both. You get me when I care, you get me when I correct, and you also get me when I call. So now, Moses, you're going to go. Moses is like, no. It's not for me. It's not going to work. And this moment develops. Moses is going to have to work it out and wrestle with it. And I always tell people when they're learning to read their Bible, be careful that when you're reading your Bible, you're going to get 1 chapter, 2 chapters that equal 10 years. So it looks tight. It looks clean. You can preach it. But when you got to live like 40 years, it's like, it's painful there. It's a long time. So there's these moments where Moses is doubting, and he'll ask God questions. Well, the people are going to ask me all these questions. And Moses doesn't believe that God still calls people like this. One, he doesn't believe that God calls broken people like him. Like, really? God, do you know that I'm a murderer? Like, I'm not clean. Like, I got stuff. Some people are going to remember who I am. Not sure, the wrestling of that. And the other thing, which a lot of people I find is disappointing sometimes, Moses is just old. He's just tired. He's just, oh man, like, isn't there a young guy out there who knows how to go on the Google and do stuff, different things? And I'm not the guy. Like, I'm really old, and he's going to start to and God's like, all grace, Moses, you're going to go. I'm calling you to go. Can I just encourage you this week that God's going to call some of you to do certain things or say certain things or encourage someone in a way that you never thought you would do? Some of you have shared some of these stories with me, and let me just tell you, I don't have a lot of like proud pastor moments that I share. I have lots of them, but I don't always share them. Let me just share one of them with you. I was talking with someone a few weeks ago, and they were saying, Dom, I'm just at work, and I'm trying to be a light to my coworkers, and I'm trying to make sense of like, Jesus is calling me to serve him in a new way. And one of my friends I was talking to, a person that I don't know super, super well, they started to tell me that stuff was going on in their lives. And and I thought, we're in a series on the desert. I think they're going through the desert. And this person said to me, I don't know what happened to me, but I just felt like I should pray for them. I'm like, okay. So what did you do? That moment where I'm like, please, please, please tell me you listen. Please tell me you listen. It's like, I prayed. I'm like, you did? And then what was that like? It was amazing. I just used the words that I knew how to use, and I prayed for them, and I said, I'm going to keep praying for you. I'm like, yes. That's a moment where the calling or the burden of caring for someone is bigger than what people are going to say about you. That's bigger going to be like, I'm not sure. They're going to think I'm weird. They're not. Don't worry about it. People thought Moses was weird. Trust me. Shows up in Egypt. Hey, I'm the guy. It's weird. There's going to be moments this week where maybe for the first time, God's going to open a door, a conversation with somebody who's going to say, did you watch the Mary Magdalene movie? You're like, hey, about that. Open door. Let me just tell you about that. I don't know if that movie's really the way it happened, but maybe you'd like to come visit the church where we're learning about the Bible and God. Maybe that's it. A calling sometimes feels like it's a Moses thing, but sometimes it begins in a small way. And the Bible's so clear about this because when God can trust you with a small thing, you then can be trusted with something bigger. That's how God calls us. And he begins to do this in our lives. And Moses is going to have to learn this, and he's going to have to go, and he's going to have to figure this out. So let me tell you one other thing about what's so special about Moses in the story before I tell you about Jesus, okay? Is that when we're in the desert, our priority is to get through the desert, learn all my lessons, remember, care, conviction, correction, calling. All right, I got them, the 4 C's, okay? And we hope that it's in the past. God never does that in the desert. God always gives us reminders to remind us that we were in the desert. This is a really important biblical idea that a lot of people don't understand. That when Moses is going to be in the desert with the people, because they're going to forget the desert, God's going to give them practices and festivals to remind them of that, which is so crazy. It's like, imagine like every time you remember a painful moment, you're like, let's go back to that. And it comes with goodness, it comes with joy. God was there, but do we really have to remember this? Do we really have to do that again? Do we really have to retell the story? Now, one of the great stories that God's going to tell the people to remember is the story of Passover. It's connected to a miracle that God does through Moses, and it's called the Passover, and they're going to have to relive this story regularly. And it's important that you know that, or else the message in the story of Jesus does not make sense. The desert is that moment where God not only sets us free and provides the miracles, but he gives us markers that he's the God who still does miracles. He still does that. So he's like, if you forget, just remember that. I don't know how you do this in your life. Like, my wife and I are trying to figure this out in our life. But ways that we remember what to do. Any of you have, like, remember last time you had a fight and you're like, oh, I forgot we were going to do this. I can't remember. Like, I forget stuff sometimes that happened like last week. Imagine something that you have to remember 100 years from now. What are you going to do with that? So oftentimes in the Bible, you'll see God telling the people, put a marker here. Put a reminder here. Not only so do you remember the difficult times, but do you remember that I was here with you in that moment? Put a marker where you remember I opened this door for you. We do it as a church when we celebrate the anniversary of our church starting. We're like, hey, let's get cake. I don't know. Let's have a kind of a moment where we celebrate that. Now, in the desert, God has a miracle, and that miracle has a marker sometimes. It's a marker for me and you to remember that God was faithful in the desert, and he's going to continue to be faithful now. Which is not intuitive for us, because what we naturally do is we want to run out of the desert and forget it. Like, it's in the past, I don't want to go back there. God's like, no, let's go back there and remember, I was with you, right? I was with you there, and I was with you here, and I'm going to be with you as you take the next step. And some of you need to remember that God is awakening in you a calling that you need to hear and you need to respond to. And I don't know what that looks like. For some of you, I think of a room this big, one or two of you should be pastors. Like, don't be confused or look down. It might be you or it might be your kids. That's the calling. Some of you have such a calling, it's going to look like you're Moses. God's going to use you to do stuff that you're like, what? I'm older now. I'm tired. What? God's like, I don't care how old you are. People will know that I'm the miracle God. I do miracles when you go. Go now. Are you going to listen to that? Or maybe you're here this morning, you're like, I don't believe God calls people. You're like Moses. You're like, God, this is not for me. And I pray that over this next few days, these weeks, that God just stirs in you a reminder. Hey, don't confuse your calling with a good career or making some extra money or having something. Don't confuse those. Those things are great. I'll bless you. But it better flow from this deep burden that I've called you to something bigger. Bigger than that. And I'm going to use you. Just watch. Surrender yourself to me. And if we move forward to when we meet Jesus in the New Testament, this week is actually the week where people are preparing for the Passover. Right? Like, you see the connection? Like Moses in the desert, now Jesus for Easter is the reminder of the desert. The reminder that Jesus is like, hey, everybody, this is it. Like, this is the time. And this is the story I just want to leave you with to kind of remember the meaning of Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday, the word Palm Sunday is not in the Bible, but it's this profound moment in the Bible where Jesus is going to start to teach his disciples the clarity of his calling. What it is that Jesus is going to have to do and only he can do it. Okay, there's some things that we can model Jesus on, and there's other things that we need to mind our own business and only Jesus can do. Okay? And we have to learn those. That's what it means to learn. This week, which is Holy Week, is Jesus refining and clarifying for his disciples what he's called to do and what he's going to do now. And they just marvel at it. Some of them are actually really confused because some of them tell Jesus, hey, we're going to do it with you. And Jesus is like, pause. No, you're not. You're not going to do this with me. I'm going to do this and you're going to watch. And when you watch me do it, you're going to be confused. Jesus is trying to prepare them, right? They're like, no, we love you. We got this. She's like, hold up, Peter, tone it down. You're going to hear a rooster. It's going to get scary. Just watch. Come back Good Friday. You'll get it, okay? This is what it says in Matthew 21 when we're introduced to Jesus kind of the last week in his earthly ministries. It says this, okay? And he comes into Jerusalem. You have it up there? And this is what it says. If anyone, sorry, you go back there. Yeah, if anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them and he will, no, sorry, go back to the other slide. There, let me set it up for you so you understand. In Matthew chapter 21, right at the beginning of Matthew, okay, Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to set up how this is going to work. And he tells his disciples to go to this town and tell them that he needs a donkey and a colt to travel with him. Now, if you're taking notes and you have a Bible and you like taking notes, just in brackets, put the word teachable moment. Jesus often sets a scenario up to teach something, the way we do sometimes. Teachers do this, right? Like with teachable moment. Jesus is setting this up for his followers. And Matthew 21, you're going to see Jesus do this. And he says, when you go, if somebody says anything to you, don't worry. Like, this has been prepared for you to learn this lesson. So you can read all of Matthew 21. You can read all of this section. And this is what he's going to say. This is what his disciples, and they asked him. This is weird. We go to the next slide. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, this donkey and this colt, and he will send them right away. This took place, okay, to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. Have you ever tried to do something that somebody asked you to do that made no sense to you? How many of you are the type of people that have to ask a lot of questions before you do something? Right? Okay, explain this to me. Okay, what's going to happen next? What if they say this, right? And this moment, the disciples are like, I think we have to go do this. This is going to be crazy. They go, they get this colt, this donkey. If you read other versions of the other Gospels talk about the story, some of them just mention donkey, some mention both. Don't be confused. The heart of the story is this, that Jesus is set up this teachable moment for his disciples, for those watching, in this last week as he lives with them in the flesh on earth with them. We get the idea of Palm Sunday for this because the story tells us as we go on that people came, they were so excited that they came and they had palm branches and they waved them and they celebrated this. Now, if you're new to Christianity or this is kind of new church, reading the Bible like this is very, very new, it probably feels very, very weird to see this prophet thing there in the middle. Like, what does that even mean? Like, that's why I don't read the Bible. It's so confusing. You ever have that feeling? I do sometimes. But so I'm going to help you with this. Matthew 21, Zechariah 9:9 is the passage that's being quoted there. Any of you know anybody who's named their child Zion? Anyone? It comes from the Bible. Every so often you hear that, you're like, oh, that's a beautiful name. This is the passage in Zechariah where we get this image. And the prophets were always telling people that a time is going to come when the one that's called by God, just like Moses was called, but a bit better, actually a lot better, is going to come, and when he shows you what he's going to do, it's going to be very, very clear. Jesus comes, and he sets up almost like a type of procession where people are kind of ramping up to celebrate that he's the king. And it's a very, very weird thing. It's very, very strange to wrap your head around this idea. Because all of us know how weird it would be to be a king who just has a donkey as like his animal that's going to help him. This is a very weird setup for Jesus to do this. It's a strange way to tell everybody, hey, I'm the guy. I'm the one. What Jesus is going to show them, and he's going to show us that power and calling and authority don't look the same in the kingdom of God. So he begins to reframe all of that for his disciples. Remember, this is a teachable moment. And he begins to do this. And I thought about why this is so hard for us to understand. I thought about how this is so hard for us to understand because when Jesus comes, he's trying to reorient everything we think we understand about God, about power, about authority. And I want to tell you a story of how hard this is to understand. My son Isaac, this week had an assignment for school, okay? And all of you are going to help us do it right now. Okay, you ready? No, I'm kidding. But I'll tell you about it. His assignment was that he had to draw a superhero en français. He had to do this whole thing en français. So you have a picture for you. This is Isaac. Okay, this is it. Isn't that awesome? Some of you might want to buy it now. When he's famous, it's going to be worth a lot of money. Put in the bids right now. It's going to be huge. So he did this whole thing, his superhero, and his superhero has to fix a problem and heal just fix something, and then he has an enemy, he has to craft all that, and he's doing that. And I thought, I was studying for my sermon, and I was helping him with this. I thought, wouldn't it be weird if Isaac draws a superhero riding on a donkey with people like waving some leaves and brings it to school? How many of you, if you're honest, the teacher would send them back and say, not a superhero, this is not a superhero? How many of you would say that? If you don't, you're already asleep. You've been asleep for 10 minutes. But you know that the teacher would be like, this is not what a hero looks like. Heroes break things, they fix things, they stomp on everyone. That's what they do. And I was trying to explain to Isaac, like, when Jesus comes, he's a different kind of hero. He does things in a different way. See, because when we have to fix things, we know how to do it. Like, we're like, this is what's going to happen. And I know the feeling of like, how fast can we fix this? God's like, no, it's not going to be that way at all. Just watch. Just pay attention. First, teachable moment. Second, you died? What? For like an hour? No, for 3 days. For 3 days? Why? What? The whole thing, this whole week is meant to kind of like blow your mind. So God can correct your view of who you think God is. So God can begin to give you a better picture of what it means that he's calling you to follow him in this way. To be the kind of person that's willing to follow God on his terms and not on your terms. We do this because Jesus shows us how to do this. Jesus shows us what it's like to come and to be a king who's going to change everything, but it's going to be hard to sell this one. Like Jesus needs a branding specialist. Those people, that's all their job is. Like, how do we brand you so you look like strong? Jesus is like, okay, I have an idea. Go get the donkey over there, bring him, and I'll ride him in. And some people can put their clothes in the front, and it's going to be great. The disciples are like, what? We can't tell anybody this. Who's going to follow you? This is not going to work. Like, when do we get swords? No, we don't need them. What? What a messed up thing. Do you see how powerful this is? That the beginning of Holy Week is Jesus about to flip the whole world upside down. Now, I want to end with telling you this one thing. We're going to be done. I'll read the passage, and you're going to maybe feel it in a clear way. This is what it says. The crowds, they went ahead of him, and those who followed shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. I'll explain that in a second. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. The whole city was stirred, and some asked, who is this? The crowds answered, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. This is him. Like Passover is that time where there's all these people. It's like the worst time. It's a police nightmare, right? It's like barricades. It's like an event, like, I don't know, think of a crazy event that we have in the city where it's like they close the streets for miles. It's like there's nowhere to sleep or eat. It's crazy. Jesus comes in and people are like, this is the guy. This is it. The disciples are like, 3 years of our lives. This is it. It's going to be great. He's going to change everything. And they're coming and the people are following and they're like, I've never heard of this Jesus guy. You sure he's the guy? Yeah, it's Jesus of Nazareth. He's the guy. We told you about him. With a donkey? Yeah? He's the guy, huh? You sure? Yeah. It's going to be great. You need to feel that to feel how upset they're going to be when he dies. And the friends go, you told me it was the guy. We thought he was the guy. We were wrong. I don't know. Like, he said the right things. He did the right things. He told us the right things. Maybe he's not the guy. He is the guy. But the way God does things is not the way we understand. The calling of Jesus and the calling in our lives, which is different than Jesus's, won't be something people will understand sometimes. But you have to step into that and say, God, is the burden that I have from you? And is my desire to serve and to give to others in the way that you've served me? Where's that coming from? We learn to do that. You know why it's so important? I want to leave you with this. It's so important that you feel a unique calling in your life. Because if you don't, one, will you not live a life worthy of that calling? And two, you will confuse calling for what the crowds say about you. That's what's going to happen. Because let me tell you, Jesus shows up, there's a lot of people there. If we started this church with 2,000 people, I would have some major issues and need counseling. Be like, look, everything I say, people are just showing up. I'm great. We all know the power of crowds. You know how you know it? Because when you post something online, you can't wait to see how many people like it. You're like, it's so weird. Like, does it matter? Does it not matter? We live in a culture that tells us you matter when other people like you. God says, that's not how this works. You matter because I've called you. You matter because I love you. You matter because I'm calling you to something that even sometimes people won't understand and they won't like it. So are you going to trust that I've given you a calling? Or are you going to worry about all these other things that are going to give you your identity? Jesus doesn't have that problem. Jesus is just being obedient in his calling. And he's going to do the right thing. People who don't have a calling never feel appreciated. Remember that. People who don't have a sense of calling always get their energy and their value when other people tell them they did a great job. Years ago, I remember learning this lesson. I was a pastor, I was a young pastor, and I was preaching. And one time I preached a sermon. I'm like, oh, it's going to be great. I'm so ready. People are going to come up. And everybody's like, it was like, I was like, I knew it. I shouldn't have been a pastor. And a mentor of mine, thankfully, a great mentor, said, Dom, that's not what this is about. You just be obedient. You're going to grow. God's going to teach you new things. Just trust him. And I remember having moments like that in my life where somebody helped me to hear my call, hear what that meant. I didn't know how. I didn't know how to make sense of that. Because I was still at the place where I was like, what are others going to think? How's that going to work? When you don't have a sense of God's call on your life because you matter, because you have a purpose, other people always have to tell you how great you are. They always have to remind you, oh, that was beautiful. I love when you do that. Oh, we could do this. I do that. This morning, the kids upstairs are learning about Palm Sunday. We better pray we raise a generation of kids who hear their calling. Because there's a crowd out there waiting to tell them who they should be. They're waiting to say, you matter when you dress like this. You're important when you sell stuff like this. You're doing this when you do this like this. All of these pressures, they're not going away. They're just ramping up. Jesus felt those pressures. Jesus knew what it was like to have all these people to say, you're going to be the king. It's going to be great. And he's like, you guys are going to be so disappointed. Oh, it's going to be painful, guys. So he gathers with his closest followers and he has a meal called the Passover meal. That's what he's going to do. And when he meets with them around that meal, he's going to tell them about what it was like when the people of God were in the desert. He's going to tell them. This Friday, we're inviting you to come back to church. For some of you, it's like, what, again? That's crazy. I can't. It's like the desert, this church. Okay. 7:30, put it in your calendar. I'll see you Friday. Okay. We're going to It's all love. It's all love. Don't send me any emails. Okay. This Friday, we're going to take some time, won't be long, to slow down, to just read that part of the story. Where Jesus is like, let me tell you about this Passover, and let me tell you about how my calling makes this meal make sense. Let me tell you. That's what he's going to do. And in that moment, the disciples have no idea that he's teaching them what it means that God's going to call them. And that they're going to have to play this part that they never thought they would play. So as we close this morning, can you just remember when you're in the desert that God does care for you? That God does have a miracle for you, and maybe correcting and loving you through that. But also that God's going to refine the things he's calling you to. Because God uses people like me and you and Moses, the earliest disciples, who have horrible pasts and broken pasts and messy pasts and feel tired and old, overwhelmed, all that stuff. And he calls us. You know what that's called? A miracle. That's what that's called. It's not flashy. You can't sell that all the time. You can't do a big conference on that. But you have to feel it. That's a miracle. That I'm here being a preacher. This is a miracle. If you were with me when I was 10 years old growing up where I grew up, you'd trust me. You wouldn't peg me to be like, Dom's the preacher. For sure he's going to be a preacher. I was shy. I was a bit chubby. I was like, you know. Ask my parents. Not that chubby people can't be preachers, but you know what I mean. I heard it like that after. I'm like, I'm going to get emails. Okay. But you meet people, you're like, you don't know for sure. You're like, I have no idea I was going to do this. But I just was saying, God, if you have a calling, a burden that I have to hear and step into where you're going to use it for a miracle about you, then I'll do it. This Holy Week, Jesus comes to redefine everything. My prayer for you is that you hear him clarify his love for you, that a calling, a sense of burden, a sense of being involved in something bigger than just I go to work, I come home, and maybe No. Don't worry about that. Something bigger than that is about to happen. Jesus goes first. Like, this is what it looks like when somebody's called and obedient to the way of the Father. Watch. And we get to follow him because we want to be people who live lives that are worthy of the fact that we have been called. Right? Just stand as we close. Father, we thank you for the message of this Palm Sunday for us. We think of the people in the crowd who needed a king, who wanted a king, who were ready but didn't understand. And we're grateful that we can read these stories now, and we live in these stories in a way that we get a bigger picture, and we're grateful for that. But this week, this special week, for those of us who are learning to follow you, may be a week where you clarify for us that you came to model what it's like to be obedient to the Father, so that you would set us free from our brokenness, our sin, our past, and use us and call us to something greater. I pray for those of us who are overwhelmed with life. Many in this room, maybe watching online, still feel like the desert feels like a hopeless place, feels like a dark place. May this be the week where they begin to understand that you're doing a miracle for them in the desert. May they sense your power to set us free even in the desert. Be with us as we go, and keep us sensitive to the fact that others around us might be open to hearing about you for the first time, and that we would come back on Good Friday and on Easter Sunday and be ready to receive what you have in store for us. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. God bless everyone. We'll see you Friday, 7:30.